Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final plenary session of this year's gathering. For the sake of leaving as much time as possible for the presentations of our distinguished guests, I'm going to make two very quick introductions. The first talk will be given by Jason Heppler, who serves as Digital Engagement Librarian and Assistant Professor of History at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Jason is also a researcher in the Spatial History Project at Stanford University. A historian of the North American West with a particular interest in suburbanization, politics and political culture, environmental history, and urban history, he is completing his first book on environmental politics in Silicon Valley after World War II. His work explores the post-war growth of the region and the ways that urban growth led to ecological disaster, introduced social inequality, and jump-started debates about urban sustainability. While Silicon Valley's high-tech companies were imagined as a clean alternative to the Rust Belt, the growth, manufacturing, and economic activity introduced challenges to the region's wildlife and its residents. Heppler earned his BA in history from South Dakota State University and his MA and PhD from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. His presentation today is titled Approaching a New Historical Atlas of Midwestern History with Deep Maps and Digital History. Our second presentation this evening comes from Brad Hunt, currently the Vice President for Research and Academic Programs at the Newberry Library in Chicago. With John B. DeVries, he is the co-author of Planning Chicago, which examines urban planning initiatives in the city since the 1950s. His history of the Chicago Housing Authority, titled Blueprint for Disaster, The Unraveling of Chicago Public Housing, won the Lewis Mumford Prize from the Society of American City and Regional Planning History. He will serve as president of the Society for 2018 and 2019. Before coming to the Newberry, Dr. Hunt was a vice provost and dean at Roosevelt University, where he was also a professor of social science and history. His presentation is titled, What is the Midwest? A Question for the Newberry Library. And with that, I'll hand things over to Jason.
Alrighty. Is this on? Everybody can hear me? Okay? Okay, good. Good. We've all had a drink and we're all very ready for this. Your host included. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and sticking around. And again, thank you to the organizers, not only for putting together what I think was a really great slate of panels here at the conference, but for inviting me to come talk about this with you all tonight. So at my office back at the University of Nebraska, on the top shelf of a bookcase next to my desk, I keep a couple of books at easy access. One of these is the Historical Atlas of the New West, and the other is the Historical Atlas of the American West. And I do this not only because I'm intensely interested in maps and fascinated by the history of cartography, but when I'm writing about and teaching the history of the American West, I try to bring place into my work. That the where of the past is just as important as the when. But if you were to crack one of these books open, if I were to hand these out to you here in the audience and you could leaf through it, you'd notice that the Midwest is missing. Or the glimpses that you get of the region are pretty fleeting. If there's a focus on the Midwest, it's to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, it's to talk about conflicts with Native people, it's to talk about bloody Kansas. But you won't find a historical atlas that explores the Midwest's urban places, that explores the region's religious history, its ethnic diversity, its historical ecology. Now, I'm in a room full of regional people that study regions, and so maybe it's not that surprising, right? These are books about the West, and so why would we include the Midwest when it's about the West? After all, we love to debate the boundaries of these regions. But, to my knowledge, there is no specific historical atlas of the American Midwest. At least nothing published in the last 30 years that I could find. There's a focus on states, places like Nebraska. The Center for Great Plains Studies published their book on Nebraska, I think, in the last year or so. And there might be what we consider overlapping regions, depending on where you draw the boundary, so the Atlas of the Great Plains, for example. But there's nothing that focuses on the Midwest as a region, that tries to use maps to explore and explain something about this region's history. So I'm here today to talk about these missing maps. But I also want to speculate a little bit about what we should do about this, what we should do next. I want to talk about why we need these maps. I want to argue that print maps are the wrong way to go about this. And I want to make a case for a new historical atlas that's grounded in digital maps. And I'm doing all of this to try and answer a couple of questions. First, can digital map making help us address the limitations of print maps? And second, if we were to build a digital Midwestern atlas, what would the next steps be for us to consider in making maps that are complex, that are nuanced, and layered in their use and understanding of the past? And I'll try and answer these questions by looking at a project that we've been developing. I've been working with the Midwestern History Association on a mapping project to look at demographic and population change in the Midwest. Everybody see this, sort of? I'll put here. If you have your laptop on hand, this is online. You can go check it out. I'll leave this here for a second so you can write it down. I've not had a room of people go visit this link, so it might crash when you do this. We'll see. And there's some limitations to the map, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of both being really excited about this map, but also criticizing it. This is the general outline of what the map does. There's a few things in this map, as I said, that it's not perfect. There's a few things that aren't working yet. But what I was trying to do, and what I think John and I were trying to think about, was how could we use a digital map to explore things like demographic and population change in the Midwest. So we have a few variables available to look at within the Midwest. Each of the counties then gets shaded based on whatever dimension of data that you're looking at here. If I turn this off, we have just these circles. These circles are cities and their populations. And so as these cities get larger in population, the circles also expand with them. I don't know why my map blinks the way it does. It's not supposed to, but that's what happens when you build this by hand. Things sometimes don't work. We'll stop this here for a minute. Anyway, if you want to check it out, it's there. We'll look at it a little closer here in a minute. So today, or tonight, I guess, is part show and tell. We'll look at this map a little bit more, and part speculation. Now, there's a lot of data out there for us as historians of the Midwest to create Midwestern maps. We could look at populations, we can look at religious denominations, we could look at transportation systems, income, demographics, location of farm bureaus, all sorts of things. But with so much historical information available to us on a range of historical issues, we're faced with a very particular set of limitations. A set of limitations that belongs to the world of books. Print maps, after all, are limited in what can be conveyed on them. We can only show so much data before the information gets too busy and you lose what you're looking at. You can only make so many marks on a page before what you're looking at becomes hard to understand, either for the reader looking at the map or for the historian trying to explain what they're seeing. And furthermore, we've all seen these historical atlases, right? What's nice about them is they're full color on glossy paper, really high quality stuff. But what that means is they're extremely expensive to produce. And so we can only include so many maps. Usually what happens in these atlases then is you're fixed in geography and you're fixed in time. In other words, print maps make it difficult to convey things that we as historians are interested in. Change over time. And it's very difficult to examine that change over time at different geographic scales of the state, county, township, neighborhood. But if we build interactive digital maps, we have a better way of using detailed sources, a better way of changing the views very easily in our data and our evidence, a way to build richer maps that I think can tell us not just more, but more humanistic things about the Midwest. But we need these digital maps to do this. We could work at different geographic scales. We can display change over time very easily. We can integrate historical evidence and sources directly into these maps. We can craft new arguments and new narratives. We often refer to this as a deep map, a map that not only visualizes data, but permits access to the sources that underlie that data. These deep maps also often embed narratives that guide readers through a spatial analysis. And these deep maps usually provide a variety of ways to look at place, how place is built, how we tell place stories. There are two key problems, I think, with print maps, print atlases. As Lori Maffley-Kipp has argued in the context of religious atlases, one is a problem with sources, and two is a problem of definitions. She argues that data tends to be limited, that historians have tended to make maps about things that are easy to count and about things that we know a lot about. And of definition, that by staying so close to these kinds of data, we tend to limit our maps. That they're not as complex and as layered and as nuanced as they could be in helping look at and understand historical events. Now, these print atlases have been ingenious. They've been dealing with complex questions faced with the constraints of print. But how can we think about digital maps to help us communicate? And what could we do to think about the next steps in imagining a Midwestern historical atlas? I'm an urban environmental historian. And for urban historians of the West in particular, I think there are large amounts of sources and evidence available for us to make maps. Same is true of the Midwest. But I think these sources often go underutilized. As I mentioned, sometimes we can only make so many marks on a page before a map becomes too difficult to visualize. And with large amounts of historical data that's available to us today, we're faced with making print maps that are, again, fixed in time and fixed in space. But what if we could take advantage of digital maps and their ability to go back and forth in geographic scales, and their ease at displaying change over time? How could we, in essence, build more humanistic maps? I'm going to pause here very briefly to talk about another project I've been working on. And if you'll permit me, we're going to go to the West for just a minute. This is the geography of the Post. This is a research project I completed with Cameron Blevins. Cameron was a PhD candidate at Stanford when I met him. Is now a professor at Northeastern. And what Cameron is looking at is the spread of post offices in the 19th century US West as a way to understand the reach of the federal government into the region. I'm sorry that I don't have the Midwest on here. I'm just perpetuating the problem. But we do have the data. So we have, Cameron and I have the entire country for both the 19th and 20th centuries. What you're looking at here is about 14,000 post offices. The 2 centuries for the whole country is something like 160,000 post offices. It's a lot of data. So we could do the Midwest if we wanted to. I think this map does 2 things extremely well. And it's something we couldn't have done without a digital map to do it. The first thing Cameron and I did is we decided to treat the post office as a proxy for a town. It's highly unlikely that you would have a post office where there are no people. This is the way people remained connected in the 19th century. All sorts of crazy stuff went through the post, not just letters. And so you wouldn't have a post office where there are no people. And what that means in this case is we have a much more granular view of what Western settlement looks like. There's a lot of places on this map that don't ever appear on a 19th century map. Some of these places exist for a year or two, the mines run dry, the economy collapses, and they disappear. They're not counted by a map, they're not counted by the Census Bureau. There's a lot of ghost towns on this map. So we have a more granular view of settlement. Second, if I were to switch this over to the other view, there's a status view. It's hard to read up there. But if I were to switch this over to a status view, and we would look at the life of these post offices over time, you would see something interesting going on in the West. Western historians for a long time have talked about this boom and bust cycle that the West goes through. Mining camps run dry, the national economy collapses, and the West kind of goes through this up and down cycle. But our map doesn't show that. What we see is what Cameron has called churn, or churning, where we might, for example, see mining camps collapse in the Southwest. You would think that they would go away and maybe at some point return in a later year or two. What you actually see is if the Southwest mining economy collapses, you see these post offices reappear someplace else in the West at the same time. Places in the Pacific Northwest, Montana, in the Intermountain West. It's about shifting people to different places. Again, this is not something we could have done without an interactive map. I can't stare at 14,000 lines in a spreadsheet and say, oh yeah, that's what's going on. Now, I point to this map because of what I think it does well. I think it does a good job of displaying change over time. And if you were to pull this map up on your laptops, you can see that there are a lot of elements that you can also play around with. There's a status view, as I mentioned, if you would just click that other tab over there. What you're able to do on this map is you can actually draw a span of time that you want to look at. So if you want to look at all the post offices that exist between 1860 and 1865, you select that span of time. If you were to click over to the status view, what you'll see is the state that a post office can be in. So within that span of time, let's say a post office opened, maybe it closed, maybe it opened and closed because it was only around for a year. Or it was founded or established before 1860 and still around after 1865. So it was open throughout that entire range of time. You can mouse over these post offices and you'll see the name of the post office, the town that it's in, how long it was around, when it was founded and closed, if it was closed. And you also see on the timeline on the bar chart on the bottom a highlight of how long that post office was around. Now, as someone who studies urban development, a map like our post office map offers one avenue for exploring settlement patterns, where people are at, where they're going. But it's a limited map, to be sure. It doesn't, for example, show the erosion of native land holdings. It doesn't map population statistics. It doesn't tell the intricate stories of particular locations. But it is good for discerning broader trends. And I think it works pretty well at that. So does our map. So this is the map we've been working on. What you're looking at is population density by county, and the circles, as I mentioned earlier, are the size of cities and their populations as it grows and sometimes shrinks. So the deeper the blue, the higher the density. The more green and yellow is smaller densities. And I think what we've made is kind of interesting. It's a map that lets us explore broad population trends. And by animating the map, I think we can see growth and decline. Cities whose populations sometimes shrink, others who grow. And again, it's useful for looking maybe at some big trends in the Midwest, where people are at, where they're going, what areas might be in decline. And I think for many of us, this is a pretty significant question for the Midwest. It's an important question for urban history, and it's an important question for its sibling, rural history. So now's the part of our time tonight together where I'm going to speculate a little bit about what we should do next. I think where the map currently excels is in showing population trends. It's the nature of the data that we're working with. I have census data, it's mapped to the county. I have city population data. To my knowledge, this is the most complete set of city population data I'm aware of. Disclaimer, I've worked on it. But if you notice cities missing or have contributions to this data, I'd love to hear from you. It's data that's being put together by Stanford's Spatial History Project, so let's talk if you have ideas. But the city population data is interesting because it's trying to track every city with a population over 5,000 from 1790 to the present. There's a lot of smaller cities in here. There's a few that only have 400 or 500 people in them. So as complete as it is, there's still a lot to do. These flows and these migrations of people are a big question for us in the Midwest. Let's look at just the first decade of the new millennium, where Midwestern population growth is concentrated primarily in and around metropolitan areas, while rural areas have continued to lose populations. Not a single state in the Midwest between 2000 and 2009 added people to its rural populations. Omaha, where I'm from, ranks as the 12th largest population center. The fastest growing city in the Midwest is Sioux Falls, 27% between 2000 and 2009. Yeah. The Midwest's pattern of metropolitan growth and rural decline is pretty dramatic and pretty striking. At a regional level, we can see population and urban transformation, but I want our maps to do more. And as I said, I believe place stories are important for how we think about and how we write about history. And while these region-wide trends can be discerned, like in the map we just saw, I want to be able to tell site-specific stories as well. For example, a handful of years ago, I had a research agenda focused on the American Indian movement. And ever since then, I've been keenly interested in mapping the avenue in Minneapolis where AIM got its start in 1968, Where are the businesses at? Where are people living? Where are the community organizations? Where's the evidence of police brutality that AIM is trying to track in the city? This kind of qualitative and quantitative look at place in Minneapolis. I try to envision something more like this. And at first glance, it may not look all that different from what we just saw. But I'm trying to mock up a different idea here. So on the left-hand side, instead of the statistics and whatnot that we saw, we have an essay. And as you scroll through this essay, you're reading about specific places in the Midwest. Specific places that are mentioned, like Chicago in my little dummy text here. A user might highlight this or click on this and be directed to where that's at in space. So people have a spatial awareness about what they're reading about or where they're at. The other way we can think about this is as people are scrolling through your essay, there are triggers that take you to different places in the Midwest. You might want to zoom in on Chicago, you might want to look at Minneapolis, it might jump you over to someplace else, it might zoom you back out. What I want, in other words, is a deeper map, a way for us to tie together narrative and analysis with interactive maps. And in this way, we can guide readers through spatial stories. How can we, with digital maps, for example, tell more complete stories about urban renewal, about residential segregation, about infrastructure development, politics, race, class, gender, environment, culture? Interactive maps can cut across any of these things and tell complicated stories about the region. Perhaps even do better than written prose. Now, this isn't to say that maps are perfect. There are lies, there are damn lies, there are statistics, and then there are maps. And maps, especially data maps like the one we've been seeing, omit as much as they add. And so we must be cautious with the maps we make. As Lori Mathley-Kipp once warned, maps are, quote, still limited by data that is partial, ambiguous, and clearly slanted towards things that could be counted in people that traditionally have been seen as significant, end quote. Our maps, in other words, too often end up being about things we already know a great deal about. And this also isn't to say that digital history is the necessary perfect medium for all of this. Digital history has plenty of its own hubris. I don't wish to amplify that too much here. But I do think digital history offers an opportunity for experimentation, to take advantage of large collections of historical sources. And to do this, we need digital maps, to work at different geographic scales, to display change over time, to integrate maps in our evidence, and to craft new narratives. Some of the maps we've looked at today don't solve all these problems. They're pretty basic in what they can do in some ways. But I think it does permit us to start thinking and addressing some of these concerns about maps, print, digital, or otherwise. In effect, with digital maps, we're able to create scores of maps, where before we could only make a few. You could tweak your data, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can make changes in time. We can start to build a more complex and detailed map of Midwestern history in a way that I think lets us ask complex questions about space and identities. And so, I hope you'll all agree with me that it's time. I think it's time to publish an atlas of the Midwest. And I think if we're going to do it, it has to be digital. Thanks.
Thanks to Jason Heppler. I really enjoyed that talk. Digital humanities work at that level is really complex and challenging, and I got to say that's to manage those kind of data sets and produce that kind of work, it's not easy at all. I know that when we do projects like this at the Newberry, we always have big grand visions of what we might do in digital humanities, and when it gets down to actually finding someone who can do it, it's really quite hard. So thank you, Jason, for that impressive talk. I'm here to talk tonight. Before I begin, I want to thank John Lauk for inviting me tonight. He's been really instrumental in getting me involved, as well as Gleaves Whitney and the Hauenstein Center for putting on this impressive conference. It's really been a terrific day for me, and I hope for all of you. This is my first trip to the Midwestern History Association, and I'm new to this regional history topic. I'm an urban historian. I've been focused much of my career on Chicago. So indulge me for a minute as I ask this question, what is the Midwest? I know many of you spent your careers asking that question and thinking about it, but I really am here to tell you about how the Newberry hopes to go about answering this question in the future. I don't have strong arguments tonight about it. We're very much in the beginning stages, and I'm really here in many ways to ask for your help, the help of the scholars and others who have spent their careers thinking about this question. Our project is funded by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we deliberately framed this topic as a question, and so this is going to be an exploration for the Newberry. Our goal is not to provide a definitive answer or even a set of answers, but instead to see how the Newberry's collections can illuminate this question and integrate the recent scholarship that has emerged, especially from this group, and present it to broader audiences. So I'm going to, in the next few years, be asking people in this room to come to the Newberry. I want to hear about your work. I want to support it. I want to build on it where possible using our collections, and I want to get your help in thinking through this as a question for a wider public. Before I dig into this, let me walk through some things about the Newberry. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we were founded in 1887, opened in 1893. We're a private, independent, free and open to the public institution. We're a special collections library, one of the most significant collections in the world with 1.5 million books, large manuscript collections, and over 500,000 maps. We have diverse collection strengths, one of which I'm going to talk to you about tonight, the Chicago and the Midwest. We're also very strong in the Renaissance. American Indians and indigenous peoples. We're a major center for the study of American Indians. We are also a genealogical center. History of the book, a topic I wasn't very familiar with when I arrived. We have people who know all about the production of books. We do maps, travel, exploration, and music and dance, as well as extensive collections in religion. But to really understand how we became a center for Midwest collections, I have to tell you about Stanley Pargellis. He's the Newberry librarian, arrived at the Newberry in 1942 at the age of 44. He was educated in Iowa, Idaho, Texas, and at the University of Nevada, and he was all set to go to Harvard Law when he got a Rhodes Scholarship, went off to Oxford and for 3 years, and came back to teach history at Caltech and then Yale for 16 years. He wrote several books on colonial America and 17th and 18th century British politics. But this doesn't begin to explain the dynamism of Pargellis. Before Pargellis arrived at the Newberry, the library was thought of as primarily a reference library with when it had a couple additional interesting collections, namely in Native Americans and Latin America, as well as in the Renaissance. All these collections scooped up after World War I in Europe, after Europe was recovering. But Pargellis arrived at the Newberry and wanted to grow the research collection and turn the Newberry into a first-class, world-class research library, de-emphasize the reference function, if you will. And he argued for growing the Newberry in new directions. One primary one was in collecting the cultural, social, and economic history of the Midwest. This is really far-sighted. This is not a time in 1942 when people are thinking about, well, we need to scoop up business history collections and literature collections. This is really a new idea in the world of libraries, which had been very much focused on rare items and not manuscript collections. With Chicago near its industrial peak, he decided he really wanted to go after business records, in part, telling the trustees of the Newberry that he wanted, quote, at least one Midwest railroad, one packing house, one Great Lakes shipping concern, and one mail order house. Now, he only got a bunch of railroads, and I wish he'd secured the others. That would have been great. But he really was a spur for business historians, in part because he told corporate executives, look, you need to tell your story too, and if the entire record that's in books that are written by people who thought you were rapacious capitalists, you're going to have a struggle, your story's going to get lost. So he really was farsighted in thinking through to have a collection to tell a much broader story. He did collect the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad records, one of our largest collections. And this it was really a fabulous collection for understanding the Midwest. It includes pictures in a series called Life Along the CB&Q, a photographic collection of thousands of images from the late 1940s, including many about life in rural America and the Midwest. Pargalis and Lloyd Lewis edited a volume of photographs in 1948 called Granger Country, a pictorial social history of the Burlington Railroad, which was published by Little and Brown. This guy is so dynamic. He also wrote a short history of engineers and engineering. And this is a guy who started out as an 18th century British and colonial historian. Really remarkable. Similarly, Pargalis collected the records of the Pullman Company, which have proven a hugely valuable source, and I don't think he understood this at the time, for African American history and genealogy in the form of employment records. Here's one, and it's really interesting because as we know about the Great Migration of African Americans, we know a lot about the Pullman porters and the communication networks that they formed, but there are also Pullman maids, and we recently had a fellow at the Newberry who was like, yeah, we've talked about the porters, what about the maids? And it's another very interesting story about gender and employment and race in the early 20th century. Pargalis also believed strongly in the creativity of Midwestern writers, and he really gobbled up a whole bunch of papers by prominent Midwestern journalists, authors, novelists, and even nonfiction writers. Sherwood Anderson, Malcolm Cowley, Harriet Monroe, founder of Poetry Magazine, a freelance journalist in the Chicago Tribune, as well as the bookstore owner and connector. She's like the Malcolm Gladwell of her, or what's Malcolm Gladwell's mother's name? I can't remember. Anyway, the connector, and this is her book, and she really brought together the Chicago's literary community, and people, everyone from Hemingway to Anderson and others wrote these long letters to Fanny Butcher, and they kind of reveal more to her than they would have to some of their male friends. And so this is really a really treasure trove of Chicago and Midwestern literary history. Pargalis, a couple last points on Pargalis. He offered Newberry fellowships in Midwestern studies. Fellowships in Midwestern studies. I would love to do that again. I've got to find a funder. Pargalis had the Rockefeller Foundation that supported this from 1944 to 1952. And he included not just scholars and historians like R. Carlisle Bully, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book entitled The Old Northwest, The Pioneer Record, 1850 to 1840. I'd never heard of that. Anybody, that ring a bell? Yeah, okay. Yeah, good. I'm going to need to know more about that. Published in 1951. This Pulitzer Prize-winning historians, but also people like Nelson Algren, City on the Make, James T. Farrell. And I'm thankful to John Lauk for introducing me to this. I think maybe one of the projects I want to undertake here is to write a history of those early fellows, the work they undertook. What happens when you create a fellowship program, and what is the long durée, if you will, of the reach of that? Pargalis, this dynamic guy, he also rescued Poetry Magazine from extinction. He raised money for it. He was out there always thinking about how do we preserve the recent past so that future scholars will gain from it. We at the Newberry continue to collect in the history of the Midwest, and our most recent acquisition are 2.5 million postcards from the Kurt Teich postcard collection. This is really an amazing set of visuals. It's indexed by location, so if you've got a town and you want to find a postcard, come on over. We have a lot to digitize still. That's going to take a lot of time and resources. But I was able to quickly pull up one from Grand Rapids, a Main Street image. I mean, it's amazing the postcards that people thought were worth publishing. You'd have just the interior of the bank lobby in the town was worthy of a postcard, which as many hopefully remember, but it's probably a new concept, was a major communication tool. This was the email of the day, for lack of a better analogy. If you wanted to send someone a quick note, you used a postcard. We also have the production files for these things, so we know who decided to order these up and how they took photographs and doctored them if they wanted to make it look a little better. So all this stuff is really fascinating. And so for not just visual historians, but for historians of the Midwest. In order to tee up our question and our project, I have one more point I need to make. I need to describe the Newberry's programmatic strengths. We currently do a large fellowship program. We don't have anything specifically for Midwest studies. We do short and long-term fellows, bring about 50 people a year to the building to use our collection. We also have 4 research centers in the history of cartography, American Indian and Indigenous Studies, the Renaissance, and Chicago Studies. And we do extensive public programming for general audiences. Now, why do I tell you all this? Well, because we've gone through, I'm at the Newberry since 2015. Even before I arrived after this grant was written to the Mellon Foundation. But as part of that grant, leading up to it, we did a series of reviews of our work. And the one key finding was that we tended to be too siloed, that the research centers didn't work together, the fellowships didn't integrate with the research centers in the way they might, and the public programming wasn't all seamlessly integrated. This is a typical problem of institutions like ours. And so when David Spadafora, our president, personally wrote a grant to the Mellon Foundation in 2015, he said he really wanted to bring everybody together around a single question. It's a way to focus an institution, to integrate not just the research centers here, but also our teacher programs, our reference librarians, our catalogers, in this multi-year research project that had multiple outcomes, including an exhibition, digital projects, scholarly symposiums, public outreach in multiple forms. And in the process, the institution, the Newberry, would be more focused in both reaching scholars and telling our stories to a general public. So our first project, and we got this grant in 2015. We're about to launch our first project. We actually did launch it. It's called Religious Change, 1450 to 1700. It is Martin Luther's 500th anniversary. We felt that our collections in the Renaissance and Humanities merited this, and we've already launched this. The coming academic year, starting really in September, we're going to start intensive planning around our next project, What is the Midwest?, with an idea of presenting it and doing a full set of programming in 2019-2020. The goal here is not to provide, again, some sort of definitive answer to this question. Instead, we want to present the multiple perspectives of the region, cultural, geographic, economic, political, and among others. We're going to have a postdoctoral fellowship. We're actually searching for that now. We're going to produce an exhibit in the fall of 2019 using Newberry materials to address this question. We're going to work on a bunch of digital projects, and I'm very excited for Jason to help us out here, among many others. And we're going to do digital projects, and as well as a major exhibition, various digital projects. Yeah, and we're going to also have a symposiums that I'm in the process of planning, and I need your ideas. I want to think through what kind of focused conversations should we have to bring the right people together and produce something that could eventually lead to various forms of publication. We've done this a lot at the Newberry. We'll bring people in for 2 days, present their papers, get that group together, figure out what works, produce edited volumes or digital or other digital projects. And we're also going to do a lot of programs for broader, more general audiences in ways that we can reach well beyond this room as we talk about what is the Midwest. Here's our new exhibition space. We're in the process of renovating this. This will take place. We're going to have 2 beautiful new galleries for this and about 3,000 square feet to present an exhibit as part of this project. We're also going to update some of our past work. We've done tremendous work on, say, Indians of the Midwest. This website's a little tired. As anybody who's worked in digital humanities knows that you do a beautiful website and 5 years later, it feels tired. Well, this is 6 years later, and it's still got fabulous material, but how can we update it with the latest in scholarship? Where is it missing pieces? What can we add? We just finished, for example, updating a website we had built in the 90s called the Historical Atlas of County Boundaries, which allows any user to know the changes in county boundaries over historical time. And they changed a lot in many states, particularly in the 19th century. And so we're updating our projects that will really support this. But let's get back to this question. So what is the Midwest? There are several challenges that I think the Newberry faces as it works to answer or provide answers to this question. We have a conceptual challenge, and I'm realizing that even more today and hearing terrific papers all day about, well, where's the Midwest? There's the geographical problem. That sounds like an entire, going down a rabbit hole in some ways. But I think we have to figure out how we're going to bound our project. Many people consider it an important part of their identity that they're Midwestern. And so these are people who are going to come to our exhibit, and they're going to want to know, am I in the Midwest? And they want to know that with some certainty, or at least we have to provide them with multiple frameworks for understanding that. That's part of the exhibit challenge. And plus, how do we put things under glass or on walls in ways that are exciting? I don't want this to be boring. I want our exhibit to be dynamic and to be to tell great stories and represent the best in scholarship. We have also this programming challenge. How do we present topics that are not just things that happen in the Midwest, but things where the region influences things? Because I was, for many years, active in the Urban History Association. John Tiefert in the audience was president of that organization. One of the challenges we always faced was, is urban history things that happen in cities? Or is it things where urbanization influences history? And I think that's, to make an analogy here, I think we have to think, how is it that region influences history, or that regional lens is going to give us new perspectives, not just whatever happened to happen in a area with a map, with a line around it on a map. And so this gets to the real question that I'm really as interested in. Well, how can the Newberry really add to scholarship on this question? We are a pretty small place. There's me, and there are a couple other people who are very interested as historians and literature people, literary scholars in this. But if we try to do this alone, that's not what we want to do. I want to grab's the wrong word. I want to bring into the Newberry people like yourselves to help us think this through in really intelligent ways. Let me walk through a few slides and show you some of the richness of our collections again in the Midwest, and how, as I was putting this together, thinking through some of these challenges. Do we go all the way back to the 18th century or 17th century when we start the question, what is the Midwest? I know people do that here all the time. We certainly have beautiful maps like this one, Nicolas de Fer's Le Cours de Mississippi ou de Saint Louis, 1718, where the Midwest is front and center. It's, as I learned at the Newberry, when you look at a map, always look at the dead center of it, and that's telling you what's most important, and here it is right in the heart of the Midwest. Is this a French Jesuit story? We've got all this Jesuit material. Is it, more importantly, a Native American story? Yes, of course. If we've got to have Native Americans front and center in this, I'm very persuaded by Doug Keel's work on this topic that the indigenous Midwest must be right in the middle of this. There's a settler colonial narrative that needs to be a framework for understanding what happened in the 18th and early 19th centuries. There's also a transportation. One more slide on this. Yeah, we have very rich materials on Native American, that really viscerally shows lands and just maps this problem. And I wonder, I can do map overload. I worry about that. Let me show you more maps then. Indian Trails to Steel Rails, 1950, from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. It gives you a sense of these are just samplings of what we have. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy envisions its railroads as former Indian trails at times. This is from Kansas City up to Omaha. Kansas City up to Omaha along the Missouri River, or wagon wheels to stainless steel. They're not quite, they're course of empire. There's a history, the way they tell it as well, that influences our thinking about region. This is from Chicago out to Denver. This is kind of sampling. Again, going back to the literature question, we have a tremendous collection here, and how do we present this to a broader public? Here's Fanny Butcher, Carl Sandburg, Galesburg, Illinois. Just a snapshot. And I wonder what they talked about. She was so at the center of so many lives of major authors, and she's in her own right a serious writer and poet. And so how are we going to tell this story in a complex way that actually makes it very human to our audiences? One of the best moves I've made since I joined the Newberry was to bring Liesl Olson back to the Newberry. For those who don't know her, this is her new book coming out in September, Chicago Renaissance Literature and Art in the Midwest Metropolis. And the word Midwest here is very intentional. She talks a lot about writers who came to Chicago, went back to their Midwest roots, and really Chicago was transformative in a way, but their Midwest origins were transformative as well. And I think this is going to be a really important piece of scholarship. She's going to be at the Newberry directing our Chicago Studies program, and will be my partner in crime, if you will, on this Midwest project, along with Diane Dillon, our Director of Exhibits and Major Projects. I want to also say that she is also she's leading an NEH Summer Institute this June and July around Bronzeville and her work that she's done previously. We need to integrate the story of the Great Migration, African-American novelists, literature, history. It's got to be central in this story as well. So I got all these threads to tell this story in a way that shows complexity, but also how do we pull region into that. I don't have the answers, and I need your help. We also have to, we'd be remiss to not address the condescension, I guess, of the rest of the country. And the Newberry has good collections here, including one of the earliest examples by the artist John McCutcheon, who appeared in the New Yorker. This one you may be familiar with. This is one of the first of this genre. This is flyover country, but with there's an article in the Midwest Review I found during the book session. I took a quick picture of it. I don't remember the author's name. Wrote an article about this very concept of the flyover and this genre, and this was in here. I did not see this image in his work, and maybe this is because it's obscure. The Chicagoan, which was a magazine intended as a response to the New Yorker, but written very much in the same style, produced this one, lampooning the New Yorker's map of the United States, where everything except New York, maybe Atlantic City, and Palm Beach is labeled Dubuque. These are all Dubuque, 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 Dubuque. Hollywood makes it, Reno makes it somehow, everything else is Dubuque. So, this is part of the story, and this does get to people's conceptions of their identity and what makes the Midwest distinctive culturally, socially, as well as economically, politically. My first impulse here is I want to interrogate that distinction based on personality. Are we nicer? I hope so, but as Eric McDuffie explained at lunch, the people of the Midwest suffer from the same human frailties and failures of phobia and racism as everywhere else. So I hope we're nicer, but I think we need to keep conceptualizing that if that's going to be a distinctive element of being Midwestern. I certainly learned that when I grew up in the Midwest. My mother's from rural Indiana, my father's from northern Minnesota, and I went off east to school, and I'd walk down the sidewalk, and I'd cross them, and I'd say hi. And they'd look at you, if they were from New York, like, are you okay? Are you off your medications or something? What's going on? I went to graduate school in California, and I walked around in the same shirts like these that my mother had always bought me. and you thought you were Attila the Hun, as you know, because you're wearing a button-down shirt in Berkeley. What are you doing? So that there's this Midwesternness that I personally felt, and that drives my real passion for this topic. And in 4 years, I hope I'm going to come back to this event, or maybe we can host it at the Newberry. And although this is a great venue, and nothing against the Hauenstein Center, wow. We don't have an auditorium like this. The chairs aren't as comfy. And I hope, you know, that this will be, I hope you'll join me as we work on this effort. I'm going to be reaching out to many people to say, what do you think? How can we do this? Can you come serve on an advisory committee? Can you help us think through curating something as we do this? I hope you'll join the Newberry and make this a project that will enhance the work of the Midwestern History Association, as well as Midwestern Studies Association, excuse me, as well as the Newberry. So thank you.
The maps really do have to be digital, I think, for this to work. And there is a question here of how that counts for people, especially in academia. I do think there needs to be partnerships with presses that do this, because it would be nice to have the imprimatur of the press on this thing, whoever that is. And there's a few presses out there trying to figure some of this out. Stanford Press has been doing some new stuff. I think North Carolina Press has some things in the works. I mean, technically it's a solved problem. The problem, I think, is culture. And how do we shift the profession to think about how digital work really counts in a way that, you know, I mean, it's deeply scholarly work that should count just like a book. But we really got to push hard to make that happen. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for you. Yeah, I do think there's a. I mean, the stuff we've kind of been working on is pretty heavily quantitative, but I think there is this kind of qualitative aspect that most maps don't try to do because it's hard. But I think we need to be part of that conversation. So yeah, sure.
We have all that data, right, Jason? It's a visualization problem fundamentally. How do you can put it on a screen, or do you want to drill down? I mean, people want to be able to drill into their area. How do you wrestle with that problem?
Yeah, it depends on, well, I mean, part of it depends on the data, right? So the stuff that we've been doing with the association is, you know, historical GIS data basically, and we're deriving certain sets of data out of that. But that's mostly a computational task, right? I have a script that just chunks through everything and spits it out, and then I visualize it. But you know, for some of this other stuff, if you're mapping like churches and things like that, that gets a little harder, and it depends on, you know, some of that data may not exist. It may be looking through photographs and archives and libraries to figure out where these places are at.
I do think that many people think, oh, just digitize that, and you know, that it's a concept that seems easy to us when our phones are so powerful and all these things are so powerful. Shouldn't it be easy? And yet it's very difficult to get clean data, to think through how can we present that. It's actually an incredibly challenging thing, which is why I think Jason's work is so impressive. The post office thing is brilliant. So go back even further. That's a great question. That's something we're going to have to yeah, if I've got so much room, or I'd love to have that explorer and the age of exploration in the Native American period is one that we're very rich in at the Newberry. Both sides of that equation, because you want to have as much of, tell as many of those stories as possible. But you're also raising the extraction, the Midwest as a site of extraction. And I don't know where the mapping data is on that. Like how many tons of ore, how many timber, how much, you know, the limestone, all the things that we extract. Okay, yeah, so we do, the Newberry does all sorts of graduate seminars. We do all sorts of work in progress papers. I'd encourage you to come down. We're going to have a special set of that around the Midwest. I'm going to want to have a seminar that'll meet on Friday once a month, where we'll bring together people, the latest work we can find, and come on down and read those papers, participate, network, and then, you know, tell us what you're interested in, and if it works, if there's a win-win situation, then let's do it. And that's, you know, we tend to think of scholarship in the humanities as this monastic world of, you know, go into the archives, go deep into some stack, and come out, you know, 2 years later with or 3 years later with a dissertation or something. This is a very social world, in my view, and that in the fellowship program at the Newberry, we encourage interaction of people who are very different fields, and they always tell us, one's a Renaissance scholar, one does 19th century American West, that they learned a lot from each other and were able to really enhance their own work just from being exposed to other methods, concepts, approaches, questions. And so, yeah, but come on down, let's have the conversation. Want to know how we can interact and partner, absolutely. We would bring busloads through to see our exhibit, but also we run teacher programs to train high school teachers in being, give them in-depth content. We feel that too many of the education schools are not strong enough on that. It's not a total indictment of them, but that the teachers are hungry for a deeper archival, even richer. Get me to the primary sources. They tell students to get to primary sources, but they never get to see primary sources. And so we bring them in for full day, and we do that. We're really good at that, and I think, and that's the kind of thing that'll be part of this as well. Yeah. Do you do any work with high school teachers? Or?
I haven't. Yeah. Something to think about.
I want to thank our two speakers. Let's give them a hand. Really interesting. And yes, we would welcome a collaboration with the Newberry. It might inspire you to have even more comfortable chairs. Seriously, it takes a team to put on an event like today's, and I couldn't be more proud of a number of people that made this team work with their A game. I think the speakers brought their A presentations to us today. It was inspiring, from our morning keynote with Michael Barone all the way up to our presentations this evening. I want to thank our donors, especially I want to remind us, Ralph Hauenstein. He may have left us physically, but he is still here spiritually and morally and intellectually, providing leadership, certainly to the director of the Hauenstein Center. This would be D-Day +1. I think back 73 years ago when Ralph was leading the intelligence effort to liberate Europe. And so we honor him. We honor all of our donors for helping make a program like this possible, where we can provide nice facilities, food, and so much else, great companionship. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank our partner, of course, John Lauk in this. This is our third. Our fourth is, we're already planning our fourth Midwestern Conference this time next year. I want to thank you in the audience. My wife and I are watching a series. We're always about 5 years behind everybody else. We're watching a series called Last Man Standing, which apparently was started many, many years ago. But you are the last audience standing, and I appreciate your persistence today to enjoy and share in great scholarly fellowship through the day. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for more. Good night.